warm welcome to Conservation Conversations with me, Sarah Mohan. Today we'll be speaking with Dr. Ullas Karanth of the Wildlife Conservation Society, and we'll be talking about how we should be managing our protected areas. Dr. Karanth, when you compare reserves in, say, Africa or America, protected areas in India are tiny. So would you say then that they therefore require more intensive management?
I would say yes, because over large landscapes, natural processes can play out. A habitat could degrade because of animals, they could move to another part of the area. These cycles don't have space to play out in tiny reserves, and the densities at which animals live in Indian reserves is very high compared to even Africa. So there's always the extra animals pouring out of these reserves. So overall your monitoring and your management, I believe, has to be much more closer. The watch has to be much more closer.
You've said in the past that creating too many water holes in protected areas is detrimental to the wildlife. Why is that?
Animals exist at some natural densities in these forests, depends on the forest type, depends on the species. When we create excess water, we shift the balance in favor of some species, and that means automatically some other species get adversely affected. For example, the four-horned antelope manages to survive at low densities, but the moment you put in water there, the cheetal numbers increase and the antelope gets pushed out. So there are these kind of interactions. The second thing is, when you increase densities to very, very high levels, that has even consequences for vegetation. For example, if you look at a South Indian deciduous forest without too much water in the normal circumstances, you may find 10 or 15 cheetal per square kilometers. But in some of our protected areas now, because of excessive water and clearing of lines and things of that nature, cheetal densities are at 100. So what that is doing is modifying the habitat, and that modification affects other species, it affects plants. So too much water is really bad. The third thing is that all these animals have evolved through stress. Over time, some years you have drought, that's when the mortality is higher. The fitness of the species or a population actually improves with elimination through stress, and drought is a major stress factor. If you permanently remove drought by filling water and supplying water to animals, that natural robustness is over time lost, and they become like domestic animals now, which can't survive without us. We don't want that to happen to wildlife.
How do we deal with fire in protected areas, and what's your opinion on fire lines?
Fire has been a part of some of our deciduous forests. It depends on what type of forest you are talking about, probably for thousands of years. So the plants and some animals are adapted to fire, but not at the intensities which they are raging now. Not every year, high temperature fires in the driest of seasons, that certainly degrades habitat. That needs to be regulated. What frequency and when fire should be there in a system is something we have to study very carefully through experimental research and then prescribe and practice. So in general, I think given the nature of our reserves, which are small, and the number of people in them, number of reasons why fires break out, I think watching over and suppressing fires is necessary. But total fire suppression may also change the structure of the habitat. This is deciduous forest. As far as tropical evergreen forests are concerned, they are not, they are not fire controlled. So having fires in them is not a good idea, and every attempt should be made to control fires.
How are fires created in protected areas? Why do they occur?
Almost all the fires in Indian protected reserves are man-made, and they are lit for a number of reasons. Sometimes people deliberately burn the forest because it makes it easier to collect forest products. It keeps the understory open, so people traveling are safe from dangerous animals like elephants. There's no element of surprise of bumping into an elephant in dense bushes. So people clear deliberately for safety. Then when you burn the forest after the dew and first showers, you get a profuse growth of green grass. So cattle grazers from villages burn the forest for this reason. disgruntled elements who want revenge against the forest department may burn fires, and sometimes fire control, if it's not done right, burning of fire lines and things, gets out of control and burns the forest. So, number of reasons for fires to spread.
What about the practice of creating view lines for better wildlife visibility for tourists?
The practice of clearing vegetation on either side of tourist roads to promote visibility and better viewing of wildlife, it's not practiced everywhere in India. In some reserves, particularly in the south, it's become a standard practice, and I don't think it's a good practice in the long run, creating 30-40 meter wide strips on either side of the road, because what happens over time, and you see this only over 30 or 40 years, you don't realize it immediately. Species like cheetal, which are grazers, congregate around these areas and they graze down the vegetation, and gradually the palatable species are replaced by unpalatable species because of grazing pressure. Secondly, these cleared areas have initially some standing trees because it's only the bushes are removed, but over time, because of wind damage and because of access to elephants or other animals to go and debark these trees, because everything around them has been cleared, these trees become weak, they get fungal attacks, and gradually the trees die. So, in the long run, if you look at Nagarhole, for example, in the last 50 years, some areas have become totally devoid of trees, wide strips full of weeds, and this is not a good idea. So, I don't think we should promote wide view lines. On the other hand, burning narrow strips to control fire is a part of fire management, and that's okay. I am talking about view lines here.
Many of our protected areas are choked with weeds, particularly species like lantana, and these are very often aggressively removed. Is that the right way to deal with the problem?
It actually depends on the context, the species. So, it's very hard to give a general answer, but overall my view is that many of these weeds have come 100, 150 years ago and become almost naturalized. Today, trying to mechanically remove them never works. It leads to enormous amount of money being wasted, and often at the end of it, either the same weed or some other weed comes in its place. I have seen very few examples of artificially trying to remove weeds succeed. On the other hand, there are some plots I have observed over 50 years in Nagarhole. With the natural vegetation succession, the factors that actually help these weeds to establish themselves, whether it is Chromalina, whether it is lantana, with the closure of the canopy, with the native shrubs coming up, gradually these weeds actually have been reduced in number and in some places actually gone away. So, I think that natural process playing out is better than us trying to do something, because I have seen very few examples of it succeeding, but I have seen enormous amount of damage and horrible amount of money being wasted on these things. That money should be spent on other conservation practices rather than weed removal.
What about periodic large-scale die-off of bamboo? They're often cited as a fire hazard and preemptively removed before flowering. Is that strategy right or wrong?
Bamboos have life cycles of 50 or 35 years depending on the species, and what I have seen is in this attempt to remove dead bamboo, the movement of laborers, the fresh fires they start, the economics of exploiting it in a way that makes sense for the contractor, all that lead to tremendous damage and suppresses the regeneration. So, one of the types of bamboo that I saw regenerate after a die-off, the regeneration actually failed in Bhadra because of this kind of interference, trying to remove the dead bamboo. With the second species, the conservationists fought and made sure nothing was removed, and in this case actually the regeneration came up. So, I think we should not try to exploit this dead bamboo. I think it should decompose. It does in a couple of years. What you need is the first 2-3 years after the die-off, you need major effort in fire control and grazing control.
There's also a Supreme Court order prohibiting the removal of dead and fallen timber from within protected areas. Why is this important?
We have to remember that a dead tree may look useless to us, may lose its timber value, but a dead tree or a snag is extremely valuable for many species. Hundreds of species that nest in holes, the birds for example, some of the birds make the holes, many others use the holes, and then many mammals like civets and flying squirrels use tree holes. So, they provide nesting space for a variety of species, and these species again pollinate other trees and vegetation. So, dead trees are very important when they are standing. Even when they fall, they provide shelter for other animals to rest or nest or burrow. They are a part of the forest, and they ultimately decompose, and that enriches the forest soil. If you remove it again, you are removing that nutrient value.
Right. Many of our protected areas have extensive road networks which are apparently required for patrolling and protection of the area. What sort of an impact, if any, do such roads have on our forests and the wildlife?
I think some roads are required because when you are rushing somewhere to suppress a fire, or when you are trying to catch a gang of poachers, the element of surprise or quickly reaching destinations is necessary. But I think many of our parks, we are far overdoing the roads. Some of the reserves I know, which are 500 to 600 square kilometers, have roads that are close to 500 kilometers. And what this does is it allows the spread of weeds along these roads, it creates an edge effect, it benefits certain species and again harms some other species. I don't think we need so many roads. It's often driven by a desire to spend money rather than a real need for a road in many cases.
The old school forester, the late Kailash Sankala, he once said in one of his books, do nothing and allow nothing to be done in the context of habitat management in protected areas. Is this a sensible approach or an extreme position, you think?
I would not say it's an extreme position. I think it's a cautious position that I would elaborate a little more, say that look, don't do something unless you know from experiment or some study that it has a beneficial consequence. Don't go on doing things because they were done in the past. A lot of management action is simply everybody repeats what his predecessor did, and that cumulatively causes more damage. So, it made sense when Project Tiger was launched to put in a few water holes, because many of these water holes had breached and animal densities were low, but then going on doing it continuously. Despite late Mr. Sankala saying it, actually what people did was quite the contrary to what he said. So, I think there is some merit in what he said. I would not say don't do anything at all, do things provided there is need is justified by some science, some research, etc. It shouldn't be on whims and fancies of individuals.
All protected areas in India have management plans. What's your assessment of these?
I have looked at quite a few management plans. I think they are overdoing the exercise. All you need is a 25 or 30 page document that lays out the reason for doing something and puts a budget. What we have is a management planning format which itself is over 100 pages. So, the management plans run into thousands of pages, and they simply follow the format and fill in activities to fill every piece of this long format. I think the management planning format needs a radical change, and we need to learn from other places where people do things much more sensibly. And the management planning for a rainforest, a desert, a different species, it has to be different for different habitats. It can't be one size fits all type of approach. I think our management planning process needs a serious review.
Dr. Karanth, how would you like to see protected areas being managed in India?
I think our protected areas are the last repositories of wild nature. They need to be managed for maintaining the entire diversity of species within them, not just to favor one species or the other through excessive intervention. Secondly, the planning, long term, short term, medium term, has to be based on research and science. It can't be based on whims and fancies of managers who change every 3 or 4 years. So, a lot of research and science is needed before you can even plan for it. Third thing is, you have to know where you are going. So, absolutely sound scientific monitoring of key species or whatever you are trying to save has to be put in place. Management cannot be just writing checks without counting what's happening to the habitat, without accounting for animal numbers. That monitoring element has to be there. Ideally, in the long run, I would like to see what some more advanced countries like US have implemented, which is called adaptive management, where You bring all the stakeholders, agree on what is the role of the park, what its outcome should be, preferably going by science to say, okay, these are the things we will do. And you go on making measurements, and over time you learn from the process of management and constantly refine your management practices. That's what I would like to see in the long run, but we are nowhere near it.
Thanks so much for speaking to us, Dr. Karanth.